China will soon lose its status as the world's most populous nation. According to UN population projections, India will overtake China in a couple of months. Is this shift in the world's so-called center of gravity cause for concern? How will that impact China's economy and the global economic growth? Also, will India replace China as the new world factory, as some are suggesting? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Tel Aviv, Israel, by Professor Gong, Vice President of Research and Strategy at the University of International Business and Economics, Israel. From Beijing, by Naijun, Associate Professor of School of Public Policy and Management at the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And from Vancouver, Canada, by Swaran Singh, Visiting Professor of the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. Gentlemen, the warmest welcome to The Point. So, Professor Gong, let me go to you first. Now, although China's population shrank slightly in 2022 last year, it still has over 1.4 billion people, but it looks like in a couple of months' time, as the UN predicts, India will replace China as the world's most populous nation. But also, according to statistics, working age population makes up about 60% of China's overall population. So will China's demographics drag down the Chinese economy and the world economy with it, as some are cautioning?
Well, the economics, there's some consensus that the overall economic growth is very much driven by demographics, driven by the population growth. And there's plenty of empirical evidence to show that the economic growth tends to slow down as population slows down. And the population growth is also driven very much by economic growth, actually. Look at the advanced economy, especially I think in the Scandinavian countries, the population has been slowing down dramatically. And this is nothing unique about China. It happens in many advanced economies, happen in Japan, happen in South Korea. So this is an overall trend that's kind of difficult to fight against. It's not necessarily a bad thing. However, having said that, I think this time around there might be a little bit different because all of a sudden we're seeing a rapid development of robotics, development of artificial intelligence. So as I see it, there's a structural change to the economy brought about by technologies. Essentially, it's a supply shock in a way. And I think this happens at a time when China's population is starting to slow down dramatically. So in a way, it alleviates the pressure on the economy, on population side.
Let me go to Professor Hu about your projections of the possible downside effect of China's population being replaced by that of India on the Chinese economy and the global economy at large. Do you think there will be a noticeable impact?
Yes, I think there must be some impacts and challenges to some sectors, such as our manufacturing sector, our labor-intensive sector, because we come to face the challenge of the so-called labor dividend, which is now obviously shifting from China to not only India, but also some other countries like Vietnam. So I think the low cost of labor advantage is not in existence in China. We are facing challenges of not only the numbers of our labor age population, but also the rising of our labor cost, because our economic growth, our wage income is much higher than it used to be. So the development pattern must be different from it used to be nearly for 40 years. So I think I agree with Professor Gong that we need to develop our technological investment. We need to develop our tertiary sector, such as healthcare, such as medicines, such as artificial intelligence, etc., etc. So there must be transfer of our own economic structure to face the challenge. But generally speaking, I'm optimistic about this because we are transferring our economy, and I think we are ready for this challenge. So we don't have to be panic. We are ready for this because nearly 10 years ago, we are trying to transfer our economic structure comparing with other kind of factors. We cannot grow as we used to be. That is, in my opinion, known to the world in more than 10 years ago.
Yeah. Professor Singh, how is this issue being discussed in India or being perceived in India, the fact that India will now be the world's #1 in terms of its population? Is it simply an economic issue? Are there other aspects that people are focusing on?
I think definitely the news coming from United Nations about India, maybe by the middle of this year, crossing China and becoming the largest population country, is definitely a talking point. But it's not going to completely change either the internal situation or equations between China and India. It really follows the trends that we have seen earlier, that prosperity in any country leads to slowing down of birth rates, increasing of longevity. Same thing is happening in China. And sooner or later, same thing will happen in India. Indeed, the growth rate of population both in China and India has over time begun to slow down, except that India's growth rate is slowing down a little slower than China. So in that sense, it is going to happen in both China and India. And of course, it does create a certain sense of both enthusiasm and responsibility as to when the workforce in India will cross the total workforce of China, what India wants to do with that workforce and how to use that demographic dividend, as we call it. Important thing to understand is that India may not really replicate and need not replicate China's success story of last 40 years, because when China started to open up and reform, that was the time when manufacturing sector was the driver of growth rates and GDPs around the world. And of course, China made best of it. And today, China produces almost 30% of global manufacturing. But world is now moving towards services sector driven by information technology related services. So India will have to increase the skill and capacity of this young workforce in that direction. So basically, it brings both a great opportunity, but also responsibility as to how to use that enormous demographic dividend that India may have. But I don't think this should be seen as a kind of a sudden change. This was a change in anticipation. And it's also a slow-moving change, which is going to continue over a period of time. So nothing in a kind of a quick shift between either the bilateral relations or the demographics in China and India. But definitely, I think India has now a younger workforce of a larger size.
Yeah.
And India has to really take care of how to empower them to be more productive.
So let's look into the nuanced picture. I mean, we basically touched upon it a little bit. And Professor Gong, let me go to you. Although the overall number may be that India will surpass China as the largest population. But if you break it down, for instance, the workforce as the percentage of the population, or gender, the percentage of women of working age who are in the labor market, and the level of training or education, or the so-called talent aspect of the demographic dividend, what are some of the nuanced pictures that are being lost in the discussion about which country is the most populous country in the world?
Well, you have actually provided almost all the answers. You're absolutely right that this is a very nuanced picture. I think what really matters is the productivity. As long as the productivity is driving economic growth, even with the shrinking labor supply, it's okay. And on top of this, of course, you raised the issue about the women participation in the workforce, the training level, the human capital issue, and also, and I think also there are also factors associated with the market. Which economy is more tuned for manufacturing, for example. These are all very important issues, probably lost in the population debate. So overall, I think my key message here is that even though China has lost its position as the biggest labor market in the world, I think it's okay because we're entering into an era where the labor market is undergoing a very fundamental and revolutionary transformation, in my view. In other words, it's not so much the quantity of the labor force that really matters, it's the quality as well as its interaction with the application of machines, robotics, and artificial intelligence. It's the right combination in a labor market that's actually winning the economy competition.
Yeah, Professor Singh, what is your reaction? Do you agree with Professor Gong's assessment that it's not necessarily the quantity, the number, but the quality of the workforce that really makes the difference? What is your take?
As he mentioned earlier, all the developed countries have undergone this process of shrinking of population, but they have continued to be robust and powerful economies. So productivity, yes, has certain amount of link to the number of workforce that each nation has, but the productivity of that workforce also depends on how skilled and how productive they are, in which case technology does play an important role. And in that sense, I think other than just infusion of technology within the workforce, of course, the whole world knows China also has an impressive record of women employment and women empowerment and women being productive. In fact, more than the global average, Chinese women have been participating in being productive for the global for the Chinese GDP. India, in that sense, has to also focus on educating and providing skills to women workforce to bring that potential into use. And likewise, I think one can also see as to what particular parts of each country, for example, in China, the northeastern provinces have been normally seeing outflow of populations to the eastern flank, where GDP in Zhejiang, in Shanghai, and Guangdong was growing much faster. Likewise, in India, for example, in India, the population growth rates in south of India are slower than population growth rates in north, whereas the skill and education is usually seen as better in south of India. So some of these internal details of various components, segments of population will have to provide a feed into the how policies are to be made and how policies will be implemented, fundamentally to ensure that both China and India continue to be productive, because put together they are virtually 40% of global population. So if these two countries are taking care of their citizens, they are automatically taking care of 40% of global population. And of course, it has spin-offs to the other global GDPs also. India today is the fastest growing leading economy already. And now is that opportunity here where the workforce is expanding and there is a greater opportunity to take it forward.
Professor Hu, China's population fell for the first time last year, alarmingly, by some 850,000. That's the first time in decades, and despite incentives and policies to encourage more birth. So has China lost its demographic dividend? I mean, to put it in a simple way, and that's the question a lot of people are asking. Has China's workforce shrank accordingly?
Well, I think the birth rate declining is very normal in any developed countries. So I think China is, in my opinion, is going into this kind of period with a rapid developed growth rate in the past. We also witnessed a kind of decline in our fertility rate. So that is very common, in my opinion. And since the 4 to 5 decades.
Well, we also had the family planning policy. I think that factor is also necessary to be mentioned. How big of a factor is that in the decline, in the trend of decline in the Chinese population?
Well, that is what I'm going to say. That there is a kind of argument that our one-child policy had led to a certain amount of less population. But I'm not totally agree with this point of view, because with our economic growth, if there is no such kind of one-child policy, our birth rate will be declining because of economic growth itself. So I think with the development in the future, our birth rate is not easy to be coming back to a higher level. So in the near future or in the long run, we must go with this kind of decline of fertility rate. But on the other hand, I think this is also kind of trigger that with the growth of our economy and society, we can have a better education and healthcare system, which will make our people with high quality. That is the so-called, in my opinion, the talent dividend, not only labor dividend, but also talent dividend. And I think with statistics and number, we can see that the average life expectancy, the healthcare situations, and especially some kind of statistics on the disease, etc., can show us that China is still maintaining a kind of advantage on the population quality because of our social development, on social security, on healthcare, on housing, etc. So I think China and India are also facing the kind of unbalanced development in different regions. Right now, both countries face the challenge of how to deliver our healthcare, education resources to the grassroots, to the rural level. So from this point of view, I think there are a lot of work to do for us to enhance our labor quality.
Professor Gong, let me get back to you because I'm sure this question is on the mind of a lot of people. How much of a factor has China's family planning policy had on the trend of Chinese population growth? There are also people who are arguing that had China not had the one-child policy, its economic growth, the rise of people's living standard wouldn't have been so fast, so quickly. What is your take on the balance? How much has China's family planning policy contributed to China's fantastic economic growth over the past few decades?
Okay, so this is actually a very good question. I don't mind taking a position that the birth control policy definitely contributed to the slowing down of the population growth. I think this policy should have stopped quite some time ago. It stopped too late, in my view. For a long time, this policy has been subject to a lot of criticism in the past. But we adopted this policy in the 1990s, 1980s, right? So it was out of 70s, I'm sorry. Yeah, 70s, yeah. So, but we adopted a policy out of the concern of population growth outpacing much more than the improvement, the development of speed of economic development and speed of productivity increase. And with that kind of a growth, population is not sustainable. So we really adopted this policy, out of urgency at the time. It played a very important historic role. And I think it definitely contributed to the immense growth in the 1980s and 1990s. But, I think the policy makers in the government should have made a much better judgment that this policy should have changed quite some time ago. And I think they did this a little bit too late and a bit too little. But that's okay. I think, we also very, like as I mentioned, that at this time there is indeed a reduced demand for the labor market at this point because of the because of the technological development, because of the development of AI, because of robotics, and I think this coincidence probably helps us a lot. Actually, even though we're all talking about the population reduction and all these issues in India and China, but also look at the real data here. Unemployment, especially unemployment among young people in China right now, is actually very high. I'm pretty sure in India, they have the same problem. 90 million jobs need to be created every year. And that's a huge challenge, right? So I don't really view the population slowing down necessarily as a bad thing. I think, right now, we're facing a challenge of unemployment at this point, and the reduced growth of population may be a blessing, if anything. So it's not necessarily bad.
Excellent point, Professor Singh. What is your take? Because it's nice to have a big family, to have a lot of people, to have a lot of young people. So you potentially have a huge workforce, but it also takes a lot of resources to feed these people. They consume a lot of resources. As we know, the Earth is experiencing crises in terms of resources and pollution, and you also have to provide education, healthcare to all of these people. So it's not just about the numbers. And Is it a curse or a blessing, really, for countries such as India, and there are other countries in Africa, for instance, whose population is growing very rapidly as well? So is it a good thing or a bad thing? Is India ready and able to cope with that challenge?
Liu Xin, first of all, I think governments can influence demographic trends to some extent. But demographies are not matter of choices that can be, sort of easily influenced. And therefore, first of all, it is now very much on expected lines that China's population has begun to shrink because of a level of development that China has reached. And as I mentioned initially, yes, it could happen in India also. But demographic dividend is something which is, understood around the world. And you mentioned Africa. It is because of demographics that Africa is today seen as a continent of the future, where both consumption and production is going to shift in terms of global trends and how the world will be moving. And I think China is majorly involved in several African countries with that understanding that that is where the growth rates are going to happen. Yes, now it comes both with the opportunities and challenges. Now, if there's a large workforce, it has to be given opportunities to be productive. And providing employment could be one way of it, but also facilitating and creating opportunities for entrepreneurs to create more opportunities. And it's not just the state. Perhaps to some extent, China, particularly in the past, had state providing for most of the employment for their own workforce. But that's not how it works in India. There are very powerful private enterprises, small level enterprises, mid-sized enterprises that also create employment. But fundamentally, I think why this is called demographic dividend is that workforce, particularly when it is young, is going to be really productive. States can create more opportunities for them, make them more productive, channelize them in the right direction, or let them do the way they want, but they will still be productive. Younger people have their whole life ahead and they want to do something in life.
Is the Indian government ready and able to provide the kind of education opportunities, for instance, before the workforce becomes productive? They need to be trained, they need to be educated, they need to be taken care of. The infant mortality, for instance, need to be kept down. So is India taking these measures seriously and taking these measures to really benefit the growing population?
Without doubt, India, as I said, the demographic shift is not something that comes as a news to any country. So India has been fully aware of that kind of demographic change in the offing. And therefore, several initiatives have been made in the past. We have now a special ministry for skill development, which focuses on creating that kind of opportunity for younger people to train them better. We also, of course, have a very large Ministry of Education. Healthcare is one of the very important missions of Indian Prime Minister, which wants to focus on using all kinds of assets that India has in terms of ancient medicine to more well-being of people, using all kinds of traditions of medicine. And in that sense, yes, there has been enormous amount of effort being made at the government level, but government is also encouraging people to find their own resources and find their own opportunities and facilitate that by creating infrastructure, by creating laws, by creating mechanisms where people can be basically more productive. Now, whether those policies are all going to be 100% success, that of course we will know in future only.
Okay. Yeah. Professor Hu, now Premier Li Qiang talked about talent dividend in China this March when he was meeting the press. What do you think exactly he meant, and what made it possible for China to be able to reap the talent dividend even if its so-called demographic dividend is diminishing?
The kind of enabling state concept is coming into place. For example, our country, China, has taken great care of the education system, the healthcare system, the housing system, and the young graduate students employment system, etc., etc. So I think what our Premier Li Qiang has said is quite clear that we will enabling our labor population, whether the quantity of the labor population is shrinking, but we must enhance the quality. So I think this is not easy. there must be a comprehensive systems and measures to help our our population to be more, in my opinion, productive. This kind of productive doesn't mean we have much higher time to labor, but we have much higher efficiency and much higher quality and much higher education intensive, not only labor intensive. So I think there are a lot of things for us to do, and our government is focusing on this. And also there are, in my opinion, kind of ideological difference between China and maybe India, for example. That is to say, in our country, that the main resources of education, healthcare, housing, etc., are majority controlled by our government. But I think in India, the market system, the market regime, in my opinion, is taking advantage. So I think through the government policy and through the government implementation, we have this kind of confidence in enhancing the human resources, in my opinion. And in some countries, if there is a market oriented, then there may be kind of pressure for any government to reallocate our resources.
I have to point out that in China, actually, the great majority of employment is done through the private sector, although the number of enterprises are greater in the private sector than the state-owned sector, although the scale is different. Finally, Professor Gong, beside the impacts on these two countries that are sharing 40% of the world's population, what is the impact for the rest of the world when, China and India are kind of locked in the talk about who has more people, who has more talent? What do you think should the world be watching out for when we're talking about who's the most populous country in the world?
Well, let me first answer the previous question. You mentioned the labor market being a very much a free market in China. You're absolutely right, actually. It's kind of like a 20/80 rule here. Even though large companies, some of them are state-owned enterprises, they, in revenue-wise, they're very large companies. But if you look at the jobs they created, the workforce of creating jobs is small and medium-sized business, actually. 80% of China's employees are actually working for private companies. Now, regarding the impact on the rest of the world, I think it's a interesting sort of a consensus in my view that the politicians in the West seem to think that China's status as a global manufacturing center is start to change. There are other alternatives like India, for example, and even Vietnam to some extent as well. That in the companies and operations, especially in low-end manufacturing, labor-intensive manufacturing, is starting to migrate to these countries, and that's also a seismic change. I think from China's perspective, we're not necessarily fighting against that trend. We're already seeing companies moving out of China, including Chinese companies specializing in low-end, labor-intensive manufacturing, and that's okay. I think our goal is to have our economy to be upgraded, to have a structural upgrade, moving towards high-end manufacturing, more value-added manufacturing, more talent-intensive, human capital-intensive manufacturing. Right. So that's okay. I think this is a overall trend is probably working both ways for China as well as India.
Mm-hmm. And I suggest people look at the latest investment number that China has just released from Japan, America, Europe, France to China. They have grown significantly over the same period of time. Last year, some by 600% by France, for instance. I think there it also shows what the big business sector is thinking about whether there is a talent or demographic dividend in China. Anyway, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Gong joining us from Tel Aviv, Israel, Professor Swaran Singh joining us from Vancouver, Canada, and Professor Naijun joining us from Beijing. With that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.